you very much, and thank you for you all being here. Also, for everyone that's part of the live stream. All right, let's start again. Welcome here, and thank you very much for everyone being here. Also, welcome to everyone that's part of the live stream. We welcome you to this launch of this important report. For a long time, the current Black Economic Empowerment Program has been presented as being the right thing to do morally. And South Africa's evil triplets, inequality, unemployment, and poverty, are the disease of our society. And then it was presented that Black economic empowerment is the way or the medicine for this specific disease. It is said that it is correcting the injustice of the past. It is said that South Africa has a racial past, and for this reason, a new racial dispensation is needed for the great recovery. And fine words have been used, like, for instance, redress and inclusivity and access and equality, growth and others. And then who could be then against this? And bowing to this emperor has been going on for a long time. Criticizing it is a mortal sin. It is like to defend apartheid. It is anti-revolutionary. It is protecting of white privilege. And if you dare to say that emperor has no clothes, you will be beheaded. No form of criticism has been allowed. And within this uncritical acceptance, silent injustice is being committed under the guise of righteousness. This specific report of this morning says the emperor has no clothes. The disease, inequality and unemployment and poverty, that's real. But the medicine is an injustice. The medicine aggravates the disease, and paradoxically, those who are the greatest victims of the injustice are those who are being presented as the beneficiaries. The silence about the injustice must be broken. And I do not want to speak on behalf of others, but certainly on behalf of Solidarity members. Solidarity members are ordinary working people, and they are not the elite. But together with other fellow workers from NUM and NUMSA and others, they have to every day endure the cruel consequences of this policy, and specifically on workers in general, regardless of race. It is workers' jobs and income that finance the enrichment of the cadre elite. To NUM and NUMSA and others, we also say stand up for workers. Black economic empowerment does not address inequality. It increases as a result of the policy. The paradox is that inequality increases particularly in the black community as a result of a small group of elites who are being radically enriched. The report shows convincingly how the so-called black economic empowerment system leads to worker disempowerment in general and black disempowerment in particular. This report shows how this policy kills the economy and kills jobs. This report shows how the elites get rich by gobbling up the jobs of workers and the poor. So blinded are they by the looting that they do not care. They are consuming the masses to satisfy their hunger for more. We, the ordinary people that work, are tired of that. We are the ones who see huge premiums of 300% or more are taken by the so-called suppliers. We are the ones who see how buyers do not even have offices and only facilitate procurement. We are the ones who have to use the most expensive toilet paper at 50 rand a roll at Eskom, and then it is still just white single-ply toilet paper. We are the ones who have to pay 20% more for our electricity as a result of Eskom's procurement policy. It is our members who are being retrenched and we who have to work short time because our employers have to pay so much more for electricity. We are the ones with a sword of retrenchment hanging over our head because a mine had to pay 57 rand for a chocolate that cost 12 rand at a local Pick n Pay. This is just one example. Employers do it because it gives them points for black empowerment on a scorecard. It is a web of elite enrichment. The one's contract is the other one's points. But unfortunately, it also means many people's jobs. What this report shows convincingly is that South Africa is a speech away from growth and job creation. And we must be honest about the current black economic empowerment policy. It has failed. Black empowerment has become elite capture. No, President Ramaphosa, it does not address inequality. It should not remain in place until everyone is equal. It increases inequality. And yes, it has huge economic cost. Not for the elites, but for the country, black and white, and especially for the masses. What we ask is deliver that one speech for the sake of growth, job creation, and equality. It is not because we are indifferent to inequality, employment, and poverty. Our members are ordinary workers and do not belong to the elite. We experience the consequences. We want to see growth and jobs, not centralize wealth. After this report, no one will ever again be able to say the current black economic elite program is there to correct injustices. The emperor has no clothes, and it is now there for all to see. Let us stop the cadre elite policy we all have to pay for. And let us go back to the drawing board to accelerate growth, because inequality, poverty, and unemployment must be addressed, not accelerated. We are not saying do nothing about poverty, nor do we want to keep the status quo. What we are saying is do something that is different, something real and definite. We say, let South Africa grow. And with this couple of words, I want to introduce this team of researchers, and I want to congratulate them. It's a brilliant piece of work, and I know there's more people that took part in this research project. It was over a couple of months, so thank you very much also for the Free Market Foundation and the Solidarity Research Institute. It's a great job. I want to introduce Martin van Staden on my right. He's head of policy of the Free Market Foundation. Tiens de Bisson, he is, okay, there's Tiens. Tiens de Bisson, economic researcher of the Solidarity Research Institute. Then Dr. Mornay Malam, senior associate affiliated with the Free Market Foundation. And Connie Mulder on my far right, he's the head of the Solidarity Research Institute. And Martin, I want to introduce you.
Thank you, Dirk, Dr. Herman, for that introduction. And thank you to everyone for making the time to be here today for this important report launch. As Dr. Herman said, I am Martin van Staden, and I am Head of Policy at the Free Market Foundation. And I'm going to take this opportunity to very briefly provide an overview of race law in South Africa today, before my colleague, Dr. Morne Malan, really dives into the detail of the costs of South Africa's arguably biggest race law. Dr. Malan did the overriding bulk of the research work from our side, and he was ably assisted by our policy officer, Zakele Mtembu, and our intern and associate, Ayanda Zulu, who is joining us here today, with our CEO, David and Sarah. So thank you to the FMF team and our colleagues at Solidarity for all the great work that has been done to go into this report. Ladies and gentlemen, please do not take it just from me that South Africa legislates by race today. Somehow this has become a controversial statement in the last few months, even though before that it was quite agreed upon. Earlier this week in his newsletter, Cyril Ramaphosa said, and I quote, "Since 1994, we have built a robust legislative framework to advance the transformation of our economy, anchored in the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act and the Employment Equity Act," close quote. Ramaphosa also, just a few weeks ago, after returning from the United States, said in Parliament quite bluntly that we will continue to see legislation employing racialized terminology and racialized provisions until South Africa has attained some kind of utopian equality that is undefinable and obviously unattainable in practice. But Ramaphosa is indeed correct that the B-BBEE Act is the anchor for the post-1994 legislative framework of race law. Not only does the Act find application through its various regulations, sector codes, and charters, but it is also regularly cross-referenced and incorporated by reference by other acts of Parliament. To take two very recent examples, the Public Procurement Act, the Property Practitioners Act, and you can think of many others, maybe most notably is the Mineral Development Act, the Mineral Resources Development Act, the CASA Act, and even something as seemingly innocuous as the Intellectual Property Rights from Publicly Financed Research and Development Act. All these incorporate the provisions of the BEE Act into their own legislative paradigms. But just to provide a general idea for you, I compiled and I continue to maintain the Index of Race Law on behalf of the South African Institute of Race Relations. The index is intended to, and it does, track the occurrences of Parliament in its legislation, making a person's race, skin color, or ethnicity legally relevant in any way since 1910. So it covers the whole existence of Parliament from its creation, and it covers the eras of segregation, that's up to 1948, the era of apartheid, 1948 to 1994, and today of transformationism, that's 1994 to today. These are very different eras of race law, ladies and gentlemen, but they are all united by one common principle, and that is that they took something over which a person has no control, that they are born with, and they made that a legally relevant consideration. So, since 1910, Parliament has adopted a total of 324, that is 324, acts that fit the criterion of race law. Again, that is legal relevance that is attached to inborn skin color. Of these 324 laws, at least 122, 122, have been adopted since the constitutional transition of 1994. That is about 40% of the total, ladies and gentlemen. And once again, of these 324 acts, 145, that's 145, remain operational in our law today, though 9 of that 145 have been deracialized primarily by the National Party in the last years of its rule. To some of you, these numbers might sound novel, but that is because the Index of Race Law is always being updated, and it really received its latest update this week. And it's no secret, anyone can access this index at racelaw.co.za. And thus far, I am aware of at least 3 mainstream media houses that have subjected the index to stress tests and to fact checks. And although they might wish, bizarrely, that these laws rather be judged on the intentions, the mere and pure intentions of those who adopted the laws, rather than the fact that they are in fact racial laws. Each of these fact checks have found that the index is robust and accurate as far as picking up occurrences of race in law. So, ladies and gentlemen, the extent of race law in South Africa is in fact a far higher number than what I have just given. And that is because the index does not yet take into account the many regulations, codes, and charters which are as binding in law as an act of parliament is. In time, the index will do so, but I just want to get out of the way that only acts of parliament are currently considered in the index. This report considers far more than that. But that means that the numbers I have just given are in fact the bare minimums of race law in South Africa. So the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act, alongside the Employment Equity Act, the Competition Act, and the Public Procurement Act, are in my view the 4 race laws that in practice make it either impossible or nearly impossible for anyone, be they a black person, white person, Indian, colored, or any of the many shades in between, to do substantive business in this country without at some point being called upon legally to account for race, to declare their own race, though they might not want to compel their employees to racialize themselves, though they might not want to, and even to require suppliers, and in some cases even clients, to identify themselves by inborn melanin content, though they might not want to. And these, ladies and gentlemen, are only 4 of many. Only 4 that already in commercial practice and in other realms of life elevate a preoccupation with color appearance over competing considerations of merit, efficiency, growth, and of course, all too often forgotten, morality and ethics. They force those who might want to live and behave as committed non-racialists to sacrifice their conscientious beliefs to the total ideological regimentation of our society according to race by the political elite. And this cost to merit, to efficiency, to morality and ethics is already sufficient today, as it was a century ago, to lead us to insist from this government to abandon its racial enterprise in favor of workable solutions that have been tried and tested all around the world throughout history that have in fact solved poverty, that have in fact reduced inequality, that have in fact led to a redress of past injustice. And what is this, ladies and gentlemen? This is a free market economy based on the rule of law, non-racialism, and that treats people not as items on a spreadsheet, but as individuals who matter, who have their own dignity, their own desires, and their own plans in life that must not necessarily just be rubbished and dismissed as secondary to the agenda of the political elite. But this racial enterprise that the state has embarked upon also has a bare minimum quantifiable cost to our fiscus and to growth. And that is what we are, I think, here today specifically to consider. And that is what Mr. Malan, Mr. Dubisson, and Mr. Mulder will get into. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much, Dirk. Now, Dirk and Martin's comments notwithstanding, I should like to begin by addressing the rationale behind the paper, perhaps in a more concrete term, and the motivation for all our preoccupation with these topics. The fact is that the South African economy is in a dreadful condition. And with each new release of data, it seems that the decline only continues to deepen and to entrench itself at a structural level. Now, we've referenced GDP, we've referenced inequality, we've referenced unemployment, but just to paint a bit more of a tangible picture there, economic growth, which averaged 3.6% per annum in the 2000s, almost halved in the 2010s to 1.7%, and midway through the current decade, South Africa is averaging less than 1% in real growth per year. Now, that has meant that for almost 2 decades now, South Africa has become a poorer and a less prosperous nation. In per capita terms, adjusting for inflation and fluctuations in the currency, we are less wealthy as a country than we were in 2008. Is it any wonder then that, that the unemployment rate should rise from the mid to low 20s in 2008 to almost 33% at present? Or that over 3/4 of the unemployed today have been so for more than a year? Now, the final topic, and this seems to be the one that's most focused on in these discussions, is inequality. And even here, you can see that if inequality is your main concern, then you should be hoping to get rid of BEE as opposed to sharpening its effects. Because whereas the Gini coefficient, based on per capita expenditure for the total population, stood at 0.67 in 2006, it crept down only slightly in 2009 to 0.65, and has largely remained there since then. Now, from a global perspective, that means that we went from being the most unequal society in the world to being only marginally less so. But that doesn't imply that nothing has changed. Whereas both within group and between group inequality, based on population group, contributed roughly equally to overall inequality at the lower end of the distribution in 2006. The former overtook the latter for every period since then. The same holds true on the higher end of the distribution, where within group inequality accounted for 58% of total inequality in 2006 and proceeded to rise to just under 70% in the latest measure, leaving the contribution for between group inequality at roughly 30%. Now, when analyzing the data for income as opposed to expenditure, the report, and this report is the National Trends in Inequality published by Statistics South Africa, found that the contribution of inequality between groups could be as low as 14%. Now, whereas this would not have been true 30 years ago, the relative impact of unequal expenditure and income by the, quote, non-Black African population groups have increasingly become moderating factors in overall inequality. Put plainly, the inequality we have today is similar in magnitude to that of the past, but it has nonetheless changed its complexion. Policies like BEE, affirmative action, and the myriad other policies that focus on promoting race-based interventions into the economy may have made little difference in the degree of inequality, but they have certainly transformed the kind of inequality in the country. Now, suffice it to say that South Africa's economy is in very poor health. The goal of our paper, and by extension this briefing, is therefore to diagnose some of the causes of our condition. We are not attempting to kill any policies, regulations, or legislation any more than a doctor could or would wish to kill a bad diet, lack of exercise, or poor sleeping habits. Similarly, we at this table today can only go so far as to identify the effects of an unhealthy economic policy lifestyle and to advocate for change. It will require a concerted act of collective will in order to adopt healthier habits in the future. However, I do believe that I've delayed matters enough, and now we'll proceed with a brief outline of the methodology and findings of the report itself. Now, the literature on B-BBEE compliance costs is limited, and whilst we do have certain sector-specific analyses, these only provide really limited insights. The B-BBEE Commission's national status and trends on broad-based Black economic empowerment does offer valuable data on compliance scores, which do reflect, we argue, some level of effort for each of the categories. For instance, the 2020 report, which covers 2019 and which is the latest report currently available, shows high scores for socioeconomic development and skills development, which suggests significant investment, but lower scores in management control and other factors. Now, these scores, while not direct financial metrics, provide a basis for estimating costs when combined with other economic indicators such as payroll data, net profit after tax, taxes themselves, and other data both from Statistics South Africa, the Treasury, and so forth. Now, the lack of comprehensive category-specific cost data does underscore the need for the study and the need for a more transparent approach to BEE in general. But we have found a way to estimate these costs, and the estimation process, as background, involves several steps. Now, first, those compliance costs from the 2020 report were used to gauge the level of effort in each category. Higher scores suggest greater spending relative to a theoretical maximum provided by the scorecard. Second, that the theoretical maximum costs were calculated based on scorecard requirements. So, for example, X% of your payroll for skills development, X% of net profit after tax for economic and social development. And third, actual costs were estimated by adjusting these maxima according to the compliance scores and reported spending where available. Finally, non-reporting entities, which do include 58% of the JSE, and many SMEs, are accounted for by assuming far lower compliance costs in general, also in line with the B-BBEE Commission's estimates. Now, I think that I've delayed things enough now. I can get to the actual figures. And that is that the study estimates annual compliance costs for BEE to be between 145 and 290 billion rand per annum. That's a wide range, and Tiens will, in his section, also explain to you why we believe that it's almost certainly on the higher end of that, of the range of the distribution there, as opposed to the lower end. Now, the highest categories of the scorecard are ownership, which accounts for roughly 30% of the total spend, and enterprise and supplier development, which likewise is about a third of spend. Next is skills development, and finally, management control and socioeconomic development make up the rest. Now, just to put that into perspective, these compliance costs imply between 2 and 4% of GDP per annum. Of course, GDP per annum. Now, of course, it is the case that whenever something happens in the economy, it also has an effect in the economy. So it's not economic activity is not a binary where it's either 0 or 1. Even corruption has some effect on the economy, and likewise, this spending isn't completely wasted. So that means that the effect likely isn't between 2 and 4% based on these estimates. There is almost certainly some positive effect as well. So, as I said, of course, some of the spend almost certainly also contributes to mild increases in economic activity. However, overall, the economic toll is stark. Now, we calculate between a 1.5 and a 3% annual GDP growth reduction just because of the compliance costs associated with BEE. So to be clear, this does not take into account indirect costs such as potential investment which didn't occur, businesses which haven't been started, or other opportunity costs that may have arisen as a result of BEE. These are purely the costs to maintain the status quo as is. Another way of viewing that 1.5 to 3% annual GDP growth reduction is to say that it means that it costs between 96 and 192,000 jobs per year. And we've calculated that based on employment elasticity data and an application of Ocon's law, which is basically a measure of what a percentage increase in GDP amounts to in terms of an increase in overall employment. Now, I'd like to conclude by noting that we are not at all in a hopeless situation. We are still very much in the doctor's office, and we could easily and dramatically improve our economic outcomes within a relatively short period of time. South Africa does have numerous positive qualities which tend to be overlooked or perhaps overshadowed by many of the bad policy decisions which have unfortunately become near ubiquitous in the policy landscape. However, despite the condition of the economy and the seeming undeniable nature of the outcomes which are plain for everyone to see, it's disheartening to see how many politicians and commentators persist in denying either the reality of the outcomes or, more commonly, their relation to the precise bad habits which they have promoted and put in place. To be sure, if any of you listening or watching today are mortified at the state of the overall economy, and why shouldn't you be, then I would like to emphasize the fact that no one sitting here at this table is responsible for those outcomes. No one here has to justify the precipitous decline in economic growth, investment, and prosperity. Our policies have not been accompanied by a dramatic rise in unemployment, which is now amongst the highest in the world. The fact that there should be any burden of proof on civil society to show that there may very well be a connection between broad and sweeping economic policies on the one hand and economic outcomes on the other is an issue in and of itself. Put plainly, and here I'll conclude and hand over to Tiens, South Africa has almost unthinkable potential to become a truly prosperous country. We all agree on that. And yet, it has not only persistently failed to realize that potential, but it is increasingly performing worse and worse. Now, finally, when given an extremely, and in some cases a uniquely poor bill of health, one can either accept the outcomes and act to change, or, and this has unfortunately been the norm in the past, deny the outcomes of the examination and persist in one's bad habits. In the latter case, however, the unhappy, albeit rather certain consequence, is that future analyses will not be analogous to a GP making a diagnosis and providing recommendations, but rather to that of a coroner, looking to determine the cause of death and narrow down the suspects in the case. And with that, I hand over to Tiens.
Thank you, Mornay. Thank you to everyone who's joining us today. Also those watching online, I look forward to answering your questions as well. This report is unlike any report I've done in the past. Usually, as you're writing, you get so used to the data and facts that you're analyzing that by the time you get to the result, you're not really shocked or you don't really think much about it anymore. But with this one, as I was reading through the final conclusion, I couldn't help wondering what kind of country we're living in, where the government goes out of its way to implement policies like this, where the results of it are clear for everyone to see, where the cost component that we analyzed are there for everyone to see, and yet the president can go on air to an international audience and say, there's no negative cost outcomes to BEE, it doesn't exist. Clearly, if you read this report, we're not imagining it. This report, I must also note, took a very limited scope. We only went and looked at direct cost implications of compliance, which can be proven and which are also clear for everyone to see. So the ultimate conclusion then is no policy that hinders economic growth could be said to be an empowerment policy in any way, shape or form. And if we look at this graph in the report that shows the eventual outcome of this policy that hinders growth by about 3% a year. Had South Africa grown at an extra 3% every year from 2007 up till 2024, which is the latest date that we have all the required data available for, South Africa's economy would have been 118% larger than what it was in 2006. Instead, it's only 29.4% larger. Now, we could get mixed up in what this means, but what it means is if the economy is not growing at a steady pace, firms aren't growing, companies aren't growing, there's no room to empower anyone, and if you then do empower someone else has to make way for you, because or people would have to wait for others to retire or leave in other ways. So new positions aren't being created, nothing is happening in terms of growth that could be redistributed. You're basically just redistributing the same thing over and over again. And this policy is unique to South Africa. All other countries that we've looked at that have similar policies aimed at redress or affirmative action clearly state that you may not discriminate, whereas South Africa and also Namibia and Malaysia have policies that say no. In order to achieve redress, you must discriminate. And as soon as you put these dampers and obstacles in the way of the free market, then obviously the result would be that you have negative outcomes. Yes. The ultimate result also is, if we look at these compliance costs, we didn't look at other things like the misappropriation of executive time, where these people are being paid really high salaries and they sit in boardrooms for days wondering how the racial makeup of their company should be changed. That makes no sense whatsoever. It's not the core business. Then also, companies now already face lower economic growth, harsher economic realities that form their background. And there's really only three things that companies can do with their profits. They can pay it out to their shareholders, and that demand will always be there. They can increase their employee wages, and that demand will also always be there. Or they could reinvest their profits in growth. But they don't get to that point where they can do it because government comes along and says, I know you have to invest this percentage in supplier development, so you'd have to pay inflated prices, you have to do this for skills development, all of that. And in this report, we're honest about it, that not all of this is necessarily money down the drain, but the fact remains that this is an expense that the company would not have incurred otherwise, and companies being what they are, they in all likelihood would have put this money to better use in order to grow companies. If everyone does this, the economy grows, and the end result of an economy that's lacking in growth is that what we're seeing in South Africa. South Africa is one of very few places in the world where people start a minimum wage job and it's normal for them to retire in that minimum wage job. The reason for that is there is no growth within the company, which leads to limited opportunities later on. If we look at what this lack of growth does to the labor market outcomes, we look at in 2008, there were roughly 14 million people in employment in South Africa. Currently, it's about 17 million people in employment. Now, if South Africa grew at a steady rate, which tracked our peers, which didn't include that 3% a year race laws penalty, we would have now had about 21 million people in employment. That's a difference of 3.8 million people that are out of employment, that have no job opportunities they can apply for because of this policy. And if to put that into further perspective, if we say, which we've proven in this report, it's because of black economic empowerment. Minority group job seekers at this point, according to quarterly labor force survey data from Statistics South Africa, there's about 600,000 people from minority groups currently looking for a job. So of those 3.8 million people who are left unemployed because of this policy, at least 3.2 million are black. That can in no way, shape or form be said to be empowering in any way ever. Sure, some people got extremely rich through BEE, but it's vastly overshadowed by this economic reality where people are left jobless, where people don't even get the opportunity to enter the labor force, where parents can't afford to send their children to proper schools, where massive amounts of opportunity is being wasted. The next Anton Rupert could be in Soshanguve right now, and nobody would ever know. That's the harsh reality and the outcome of these policies. So if we look at the third very important graph in this report, there's many other important graphs that I encourage you to look at as well. We started the unemployment rate in South Africa at roughly 25%. It's since worsened to 31.9%. Had we grown by an extra 3% every year, unemployment would now be at 17%. If that is not shocking enough, and if that is not enough reason to get rid of these policies, then I don't know what would be. So we call upon government, all stakeholders, to put pressure on to normalize South Africa's economy. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I would like to thank the Free Market Foundation and my colleagues. I think this has been a wonderful collaboration, and if you read through the report, you'll see that it is really extensively researched, properly detailed, and it's unfortunately the first report of its kind to examine a public policy that's been in force for more than 20 years, which is unthinkable when you think about it that way. Thomas Sowell, the economist, said policies are measured by their outcomes, not their intentions. And that is exactly what we set out to do, to have a harsh focus on the outcome of this policy, despite the president, etc., constantly defending the intentions of the policy, but completely ignoring the outcomes. So we had President Ramaphosa's newsletter on Monday, which once again, you would notice there's a distinct lack of numbers in all his defenses of these policies because they don't exist. So he stated in his newsletter that transformation drives growth. This is something that I think we who've actually measured the outcomes can say that is not the case. Where he is correct, however, is that growth does drive transformation because growth solves almost all your problems when you want to redress a country. In South Africa, it's actually rather simple. If we shift the focus from redistribution to growth, the redistribution will happen by itself. The economy will transform just due to the demographics of the labor market. And that means that although President Ramaphosa got half of the equation right, unfortunately his party's focus has been on the wrong half, which constantly says as long as you give more to the black elite, somehow the rest of us will also benefit. The most important part about these policies, however, is we never stop to ask the question, what does success actually look like? When will South Africa then have success in enabling economic inclusion of masses of poor, etc.? At the moment, I think we can answer that South Africa is not what success looks like. Success cannot be kicking a cricket team out of the final because they used the wrong type of black bowler, which is something that actually happened in South Africa. It cannot be one of our members having to tell his sons that they can't inherit the shares that he got because he's Indian, but he married a white woman. So he cannot actually let them inherit the shares because at that point the equity score would be wrong. This is not what a winning country looks like. When we look at the average South African citizen, it is quite obvious. We've got an idea that says success is working for it, and that is what South Africa wants. South Africa works when South Africans work. And what this policy has done is it has very successfully excluded South Africans from the labor market, whilst very, very successfully enriching a small elite beyond all imagination. Up until, if we have to go cheek and tongue, they have to store their money in couches because the banks don't have places anymore. So that is what it has achieved. What we find, we're one speech away from actual success, which is getting radical, almost reckless economic growth going in South Africa. If we can get that going, transformation automatically happens. We've now had this policy for 20 years. It's not early days. This policy is almost 21, and we've never actually had that discussion that says, all right, what does success look like? Is this succeeding or not? And I think the reason we haven't had that is because the policy is indeed succeeding for a very small elite, and they tend to get most of the mic time. So, what will critics say? Well, the first critic was the president in parliament who answered and said, no, we're just longing for apartheid and we want to once again entrench our privilege. And then, of course, he asked, why don't we want black people to be rich? Now, despite the hypocrisy of a black billionaire asking, why don't you want me to be rich, which is what practically happened, the answer is no. Critics of this policy are not automatically apartheid apologists. In fact, I've not met anyone who's criticized the policy and said that we should go back to 1980s economic policy. Every single person who criticizes this policy suggests that we move towards a much more free market policy than we've ever had before. And they state several international examples that show what a free market policy can do. So no, this is not at all. Are we wanting to entrench privilege? I think the only policy that actually entrenches privilege is the current one. If you look at what happened with the top 1% and top 10% of black earners, they've become immensely wealthy, but at the cost of everyone else. The bottom 50%, regardless of race, has lost significant real income in order to fund a couple of fat cats, and that is what we've seen this policy do. So no, that is not, we're not the ones trying to do that. What we do know is that South Africa cannot continue. So we're not saying do nothing. Do nothing to the abject poor that we see. Do nothing when you see grown men standing in a robot having to beg to feed their families. I think you would be heartless to look at that situation and say, look, you're on your own. We're simply saying, do something else. What you're doing at the moment is not helping. It's worsening the situation, and it's not going to get those people into the labor market. Do something else that has only one focus, and that is getting people into jobs. At the moment, we're focusing on what color the people in jobs are. We should much rather focus on getting anyone into a job as quickly as possible. We, as a country, we're at a crossroads. I see we had an announcement of the national dialogue, but if you look at the invitation, it looks much more like an African national dialogue than it's going to be a proper national dialogue from all civil society. But we have to choose as a country. Thus far, the economic wounds that we've suffered has been self-inflicted, honestly. We're in this situation because we've chosen this time and time again, disregarding all outcomes that have shown that it's not working, and this would be the most direct estimation of what the actual costs are. 3% GDP growth, it's a number and it sounds fancy, but that's 3.8 million people that don't have jobs because of this policy. That's 4 million households, that's children going to university, going to school, and succeeding. That's intergenerational wealth that gets created. And that is the cost of this policy. And we really have to ask as a country, what exactly has the benefit been? This report only deals with the direct costs. We're not even talking about the indirect costs. Judge Zondo explicitly stated in his report, BEE was one of the main factors that drove the corruption regarding state capture, that it was the door through which Zuma and his patronage network successfully managed to capture several of our state-owned institutions. The other indirect costs that we saw, one example being Starlink, which now has become very controversial, but it's capital flight. In the ANC's terms, they call it an investment strike, as if investors are on one WhatsApp group and decide, okay, we're not going to invest. What they're actually describing is you've got risk managers in every company in this country coming to the conclusion that South Africa is uninvestable at the moment. And when you wonder why, you don't need to go further than the World Bank, which states your BEE policies are deterring investment. So that's the indirect cost, which we haven't even started to touch. We could be much, much further ahead than we are at the moment if we weren't simply enriching a small elite at the cost of everyone else. So what we've practically seen with these policies is we've had economic capture by a small group of cadres that have decided to facilitate the economy to work for them. We need to have a long and hard discussion as a country about what does success look like and what are we going to choose. At the moment, we're as a country focusing intensely on the team photo, making sure that the right amount of people are the right amount of color, when what we should be focusing on to be a winning country is the scoreboard. Now, the advantage is South Africa is very good at winning World Cups. We're just not good at economically winning. And I think it's time that we translate the winning culture that we know we have, that we know we can facilitate, into actually making sure that we are focusing intensely on the scoreboard, putting the pressure on these cadres and cronies who are the ones benefiting from this policy to enable them to finally free South Africa so that we can grow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie. We can now move to any questions. Let's start with questions from the floor.
Baie dankie. Ek's Monica van Marula Media. Ek het twee vrae. Een vir Morney wat 'n bietjie gepraat het oor die verryking van die elites. Ek wil oor daai vrae brei asseblief uit oor hoe die elites presies ten koste van die armes verryk is, die intra-ongelykheid in die swart groep wat vergroot het, en in watter mate is daar oorvleeling tussen hierdie verrykte elites en die huidige regerende klas? Of is dit nie iets waarop jy gefokus het nie? En dan vir Dirk, wil ek vir jou asseblief vra, nou dat die verslag geskryf is, wat gaan julle daarmee doen? Wat is die vooruitsigte daarvan om veral vir 'n vakbond soos Solidariteit om onder ander vakbonde en vakverbonde soos COSATU 'n anti-SEB sentiment aan te moedig, gegee die feit dat dit die swart werkersklas is wat ook van die grootste slagoffers van hierdie beleid is? Dankie.
Dankie Monica. Ja, die fokus van hierdie verslag was nie regtig om te kyk na tot watter mate is daar is dit gekaap deur die elite nie. Ek dink of die ja, en dan spesifiek elite wat gekoppel is aan die regering nie. Ek dink daar is eintlik redelike goeie dokumentasie oor dit alreeds. En ek weet byvoorbeeld dat professor William Gumede van Wits Universiteit, hy het al studies gedoen op sy eie wat hy gekyk het na die hoeveelheid geld wat spandeer is en die hoeveelheid geld veral in daai eienaarskapselement van die SAB telkaart. En die mate waartoe ek dink sy beraming is dat dit omtrent 1000 miljard wat gekonsentreer is na so rondom 100 individue. So ons praat van 'n astronomiese konsentrasie van welvaart, astronomiese en jy kan maar noem 'n kaping van welvaart en van hulpbronne in Suid-Afrika en per definisie gaan so ietsie dan nou ongelykheid oor die algemeen en ongelykheid dan spesifiek binne die swart goed opdryf. Weer eens, daai is net 'n feit. Die feit, daar's 'n feit dat daar's binne die swart groep 'n groot toename in ongelykheid en die voor die hand liggende verduideliking daarvoor is eintlik maar net dat is as gevolg van hierdie stelsel.
Ja, baie dankie Monica. Die verslag het ons genoem is 'n instrument wat wys die keiser is skaal. Verlang was daar geen kritiek teen swart ekonomiese bemagtiging nie, eenvoudig omdat dit verpak is in morele terme. So jy kon bykans dit nie aanval nie en die verslag was dapper genoeg om te gaan om te sê hier is die werklikheid, die keiser is skaal. En die interessante is dat die werklikheid wys dat die grootste slagoffers hiervan is gewone werkende mense en arme mense. En ons het al reeds begin gesprek voer met NUMSA, as ook met COSATU, oor swart ekonomiese bemagtiging en wat moontlik alternatiewe kan wees daarvan. Maar hierdie verslag gaan beslis momentum gee daaraan en ons gaan op 'n groot skaal met hierdie verslag aan die hand met 'n veldtog begin om te sê dat rassewette in Suid-Afrika moet stop. En dit is nie omdat ons onsensitief is teenoor ongelykheid, armoede en werkloosheid nie. Dit is omdat ons juist positief voel daaroor. Ons veldtog sal die volgende insluit. In die eerste plek, met hierdie inligting tot ons beskikking, gesprekke met ander vakbonde, om te kyk na alternatiewe. In die tweede plek gaan ons voort met litigasie, teen verskeie van hierdie beleidsrigting, soos byvoorbeeld die beplande rassefonds wat voorlê. En die derde plek gaan ons voort met internasionale druk. Die internasionale druk se hoogtepunt gaan opbou na die G20 beraad toe. Ons fokus gaan daar spesifiek wees dat daar druk vanuit die buiteland geplaas moet word, sodat Suid-Afrika sy raswetgewing uitfaseer, om die eenvoudige rede, dit beperk groei en dit beperk beleggingsgeleenthede. So dis 3, plaaslik gesprek met NUMSA, COSATU en ander vakbonde, as ook werkgewers, in die tweede plek litigasie en die derde plek ook internasionale druk. Maybe I can just summarize this in English, but I know there's a lot of international journalists also online at this stage. It was asked, what are we going to do with this specific report? And the first thing is, this report shows that those that are to the detriment affected by the current Black Economic Program is the people, ordinary people that work, and poor people, and those that are beneficiaries are actually the elite. And that is why we will engage with COSATU trade unions, especially NUMSA and others, to find alternatives for the current race legislation, the race regime in South Africa. In the second place, we will continue with litigation, for instance, against the 100 billion rand race fund that they plan. And in the third place, we will also put pressure on the international world and also on South Africa via the international world, especially with the G20 that comes.
Any other questions from the floor? I can perhaps just ask one of these questions that's come up through social media here. It's more of a statement, but perhaps one of the members of the panel can just answer this question. Don't you know that South Africa is not the only country, I'm translating now, that has redress policies? What makes South Africa special in this regard?
Yeah, of course, we devoted an entire chapter of the report to redress policies in other countries. And the notable exception that South Africa has, and to an extent Namibia, is that in other countries, the redress policies are an attempt to either include people politically that were included politically, to make sure that, for instance, certain tribes and castes in India have political representation. Then also in Brazil, for instance, to ensure that people from disadvantaged background get admission to university. In Malaysia and Namibia, they have a much more intrusive policy, but none of them go as far as in South Africa, where they insist that you spend a certain amount of your profits on certain projects. That's unique to South Africa. So yes, we are well aware that we're not the only one, but we should also note that no other country goes as far as we do in South Africa.
There are a few questions also relating to Dirk's answer from earlier, what steps are to be taken both internationally and locally to make sure that this reaches the right eyes and ears. There's another question here, which I feel is valid enough to ask. Again, this is a translation. Does anyone on the panel know how black people feel about this policy?
Well, firstly, I think we don't directly know because we aren't black people, as you will see, but we have had several polls that come out in the last 2 decades regarding what are the actual needs and wants of South African citizens, and then they would aggregate that by race. The Institute for Racial Relations does that poll several times, and the answer is very simple. The number one need is a job. Black South Africans want jobs. All South Africans want a job. And it's not rocket surgery in a country with 30 to 40% unemployment. Obviously, people desperately want jobs. And that is one of the things that we've seen is your average South African citizen does not really want a handout, they want a hand up. They want to get into the labor market, advance their career, get their children into school, and create some generational wealth. And these policies have done absolutely nothing to actually do that. In fact, it has worsened black unemployment, it has worsened black inequality, and it has worsened poverty for all racial groups, including black people then. So what we're saying is we're not standing stone-hearted and saying, oh, well, no, you need to sit in your unemployment. We're saying we need to do something else. What we're doing at the moment is creating more unemployment. It's creating less jobs. As simple as that. We can be growing at almost double the rate if you look at the GDP graph. We should have 4 million more people into jobs. And that has been the number one priority of all South African citizens has been we want a job, and we know how to do that. If we look at international examples, it's literally, we're not the ones pioneering what these policies will do. Redress policies in Malaysia, etc., have gone and created a small racial rent-seeking elite. It has done exactly that in other countries, and free market policies have reduced poverty, have reduced inequality, and created a thriving middle class in other countries. We need to choose which one do we want. Thus far, we've been choosing the elite. We're saying it's time to choose ourselves. Let's choose growth, let's choose a thriving middle class, which will hopefully and almost definitely be overwhelmingly black, just due to the fact that South Africa is overwhelmingly black. So that's the irony of the matter is, will our members benefit from growth? Yes, because everyone benefits from growth. But the biggest beneficiaries is going to be someone who's currently unemployed in a township with no prospects of getting a job, and suddenly getting into the labor market is a possibility, which then leads to having a career, being able to afford a home, being able to afford a car, and being able to have children and send them to school and university. That is what has been stolen from you, in short. That is what growth does. So yes, I think we know what the average South African wants, and we actually know how to get there. We're not the only ones. This is not a secret somewhere hidden. It's very simple. We need to ask why we haven't gone down that path as a country yet.
If I can just add to that, the IRR's research actually specifically asks about BEE. So it does have the prioritization of what is most important to you, jobs, crime, etc. And then at the very bottom, you have stuff like land reform and so-called inequality and racism and so on. It's not a priority for most people. But other than that priority list, the IRR does specifically ask in its demographically representative surveys, should people be appointed based on race, or should they be appointed based on the other meritocratic considerations, experience, and so forth? And it's not even close. Across the lines, each racial group says race should not be the primary criterion, or probably a criterion at all. People should be appointed based on merit. So those IRR reports, surveys, consistently over 2 decades, specifically asked about BE and BE type policy, and again, it's not even close. Most South Africans think or realize that this isn't working. I mean, it's, as Connie says, it's not a secret, it's not a conspiracy by the far right to say that these things aren't working. We can see it every day, everyone can feel it and experience it. It's the lived experience of everyone, and that reflects in the survey outcomes.
I was very pleased to see Connie quoting Thomas Sowell in his remarks. Another Sowell quote, which I think is apt, is there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And I think the BEE policy has made that trade-off of jobs and growth versus political elite enrichment. But in addition to the state-led dimension of BEE, there's also a private sector component to it. And I wanted to address this to the panel generally. To what extent would you say that private actors have been complicit in reinforcing BEE, which began in many sectors as a voluntary, aspirational set of guidelines or doctrines, and which has now become heavily enforceable? And particularly if you consider how procurement supply chains, for example, are used to feed BEE down the chain. And further to that, how could corporations that want to pursue non-racial objectives to resist this very explicitly politicized nature of doing business, how could they start to push back against some of these edicts?
Yeah, I think firstly on to what extent are the private sector also taking the lead here? I think increasingly so. The old adage is that big business loves big government. And it's actually one of the things that, ironically, one of the main complaints is often, particularly when it comes to competition policy and so forth, is that there's a very big concentration in almost every sector, and in particularly in sectors such as finance and mining and ICT and so forth. So a very big concentration in those sectors. But the fact is that more often than not, your big corporates, they tend to benefit from higher barriers to entry. So they're quite happy to keep these sort of systems in place, because that means that it's impossible for people to compete with them. The clearest example, and Connie mentioned it earlier, is Starlink. Here is a potential competitor to a very concentrated ICT sector, but we're not going to see, at least if the proponents of the policies get their way, we're not going to see increased competition because we've erected barriers. The same thing is true in numerous other sectors, particularly when it comes to companies, and maybe I shouldn't mention companies in particular, but the fact is that there are these vast concentrations within particular corporations, and those particular corporations do benefit from keeping these barriers in place, and that's why they also promote these barriers. Now, in the past, when it was voluntary, you can also see it in the economic data. It didn't have as much of an effect. Now that it's mandated, and now that it's a barrier to entry, there's a moat around different sectors and around a particular growth trajectory, then you have a far larger effect. So I think there is definitely some complicity, and I think there's a reason why plenty of the companies are happy to comply, because they also benefit from doing so.
My name is Ayanda Zulu. I am an intern and associate at the FMF, and I'm with David Ansara, our CEO. I think my first point about private actors, this is just a point in passing that I want to make, which isn't related to this report. As a student, looking at the role of some private actors, in being complicit in BEE policy. So how it works in the student sector of accommodation is that you have people who provide accommodation. And some of these companies, what has been found is that they have BEE partners who are in government. So how it works is the university gives accreditation to those student accommodation providers. And because their BEE partners are in government and they want to benefit, they deny other stakeholders accreditation, and they only give accreditation to those stakeholders who have BEE partners in their companies. And then what they do is to inflate the prices of accommodation, effectively pushing out other market players. And that drains the money of NSFAS and constitutes wasteful expenditure. So it's just a point to add in that regard. But I think my question is directed to Dr. Malan. I am aware that this report broadly focused on the costs associated with BEE. But I wanted us to zoom in specifically on something which I've also been researching, which is preferential procurement, and the kind of money we've lost to that as well over the years, where you have a loaf of bread, being priced at 45 rands, for instance, because of BEE premiums. So I think something which I would like to ask is, how do we end up having a situation where, for example, during COVID, over 20 million rand is given to someone to procure masks? How do we end up having a situation where, as I've said now, a loaf of bread, which costs 22 rands, ends up being 45 rands? I think that's very important information for also our audience watching live as well.
I think that the notion is often that human beings are flawed creatures. We tend to be selfish, we tend to be driven by our passions, we tend to want to further our own interests. And quite often, more often than not, the argument is that you need a government to sort of allay those more base passions and make sure that to ensure that the private actors don't abuse their power in order to enrich themselves. But the fact is that the government is also filled with people, and if it is true that people are driven by accomplishing or satisfying their own interests and furthering their own cause, then you'll see that people in government also act in order to enrich themselves. And if the question is, how do these policies keep perpetuating themselves, then the answer, it seems to me, is that the people implementing those policies and those close to them are benefiting from it. And they've managed to get a broad enough, although very tight circle of people who also benefit from it and who are willing to provide their support in order to continue furthering the policy as far as possible. And whenever you have these kinds of situations, you have these incredibly concentrated benefits. So a very small group of people get fabulously wealthy, but you have very dispersed costs. So 1.5 or 3% loss in GDP, if you spread that over the entire population, it's not as tangible. But 300% increase in the particular product that you're selling, that's very tangible. So there's a very strong incentive for those benefiting to keep it in place. But unless we actually go about making these costs more transparent and actually informing people as to what it's doing to the economy, the incentives for the people actually being done in by the policy are not as strong as they otherwise could be.
Could I add to that? So just on procurement specifically, the way the new Public Procurement Act works, and this is to an extent how the old Preferential Public Procurement Policy Framework Act also works, is that there is something that you could call like pre-qualification criteria. So what that effectively means is the government puts out a bid for we want to procure for X service. Let's say the government wants to provide bread in a given area because of some humanitarian issue that's occurring there. The government says, let's tender from bread companies to provide bread there. If your bread company does not meet a certain threshold of BEE points, a certain preset threshold, you do not even get to bid. You do not even get to put your foot in the door. So you could potentially have a business model that has the highest quality bread at the lowest possible price, at 10 Rand a loaf of bread. You could have all of that figured out. You could be a revolutionary in your industry. If you do not hit that threshold, the government says, do not speak to us. We do not want to see you. They're only going to speak to people over that threshold, and then you could still be untransformed. And the closer you are to that threshold, the less chances are that you're going to get the contract. The more transformed and BEE compliant you are, in other words, the more race-focused you have been in constituting your company and your business model, suppliers, clients even, socioeconomic investment, the higher your chances of getting the contract. So that just necessarily means that there's added costs to the ultimate end user and to the government, to the taxpayer. But the most shocking thing, and the business group Sakeliga has done great work on this, is the pre-qualification criteria. To just say that, listen, we're not even going to consider how good your product is, how quickly you can deliver it. If you do not hit this BEE score, we don't want to see you. That is the reality of preferential procurement in South Africa.
Okay, I just want to ask Tiens, on that specific point. We've done a separate study on the influence of BEE premiums on electricity cost. If you can just summarize that, and that will then be the last answer.
Yeah, thank you, Dirk. I actually kept thinking about this during your question being asked. And I mean, how much more immoral can it get to, during these winter months, to now know that because of BEE and especially preferential procurement policies at Eskom and localization rules, etc., your electricity is costing 27% more than what it should. Because it did quite a number of things. It mainly where the initial damage was done was because of preferential procurement policies. It consolidated the coal industry around a very few companies. It went from where Eskom purchased coal as a rule from 27 suppliers to 5. And now only those 5 are competing, and it's very easy to collude, especially if you're colluding with the state's blessing. Then it becomes very easy to do that, and then it just ran away from there. But 27% premium is paid on electricity for that, and you can imagine the knock-on effect that is also had. So yeah, to that point, many people say it's not just BEE. Remember, we had electricity problems, etc. But many of these electricity problems were also caused by these same policies. Thank you.
May I just ask another question quickly? It comes from Netwerk 24. So both Dirk Herman and Connie Mulder mentioned that they're not saying nothing should be done, but that something else should be done. What is that something else?
Goed, ek gaan eers antwoord en dan gaan ek vir Connie vra. Daar's 2 stappe. Die eerste stap is om die huidige wetgewing net eenvoudig uit te faseer. Dis miskien die mees ingrypende ding wat mens kan doen om groei te stimuleer en werk te skep. So dis die eerste ding wat ons moet doen. Ons moet die negatiewe beleid stop. Net deur die negatiewe beleid te stop sal 'n reuse invloed hê. Die Verenigde Nasies se menslike hulpbronne verslag gee eintlik vir ons baie duidelike aanduidings oor wat om te doen. En die belangrikste aanduiding wat hulle gee is dat die skuif moet kom van wat hulle noem uitsetgebaseerde regstellende programme na insetgebaseerde regstellende aksie. En die insetgebaseerde programme fokus dan spesifiek op opleiding, ontwikkeling, gemeenskapsontwikkeling, insette wat dan tot spesifieke uitsette lei. En dis die groot skuif. Op die oomblik is die Suid-Afrikaanse rasprogram 'n uitsetgebaseerde program. Ons sien dit ook met die onlangse rasregulasies, dat die onlangse rasregulasies was is uitsetgebaseerde regulasies wat streng dan gemeet word aan die hand van rasuitsette, terwyl ons moet skuif na insetgebaseerde. So dis twee stappe. Stop die huidige program en implementeer dan programme wat meer insetgebaseerd is. Die persoon wat uitstekende werk hieroor gedoen het is Anthea Jeffrey, wat wonderlike voorstelle gemaak het is hoe kan 'n insetgebaseerde program lyk. Just to summarize in English as well. The first step to improve the current situation is simply to stop the current program, because the current program is driving joblessness and inequality. So that's the first step, and that can be a great step. But the second thing is to change the focus from output-based affirmative programs, that is to drive numbers with a calculator, and that is the current focus of the South African race programs, to an input-based program, and that is training, development, and other forms of development. But Connie?
Just to add, there's just one more thing that is necessary for economic growth. It's firstly getting the input, focusing on the input side, not on the output side. Deregulating, meaning stopping the program. And then the third focus would be getting real serious about law and order and infrastructure. Meaning we tend to promote criminals rather than put them in jail in South Africa. We have a whole report of people who stole, and several of them are still in government for some weird reason. Judge Zondo summarized how they successfully looted the state, and there's been very little action in that regard, and that filters down to everybody, the man on the street who's become accustomed to knowing there's not really going to be any punishment for crime in South Africa. If you want to do something, if you want to steal something, you can get away with it. So law and order is very important for economic growth. And the second part is, but once you stop the policies where tenderpreneurs would loot a state project instead of actually building the bridge, then you can get to fixing the infrastructure. Because for business, it's really simple. If I put something on a train, I need to have confidence that that will arrive at a harbor on time and get loaded onto a ship on time, if you're an export business. And South Africa is not doing that at the moment. We have Transnet that's desperately struggling to actually do freight rail. We are killing all our roads because freight rail is not available, so the trucks are now driving. So if we focus on those two things, along with getting skills into people, which is also known as education, then at that point, we're suddenly going to have an economy that grows, that accommodates a skilled labor force that we can actually get in. But unfortunately, we've seen, due to vested interests, the government has not been that interested in reducing crime, especially corporate crime or then corruption. And then with infrastructure, we've had this whole octopus on top of it, which has siphoned funds from the fiscus into if you trust Professor Grumede, into a couple of hundred individuals who's gotten extremely rich due to that.
I just want to add something on that from the Free Market Foundation side. And I think the key thing that Dirk already said is the first thing you do is you stop doing the bad thing. A lot of people often get stuck on, well, what's the alternative? And we need a new progressive idea. I think the simplicity of just cease doing the destructive thing is often missed. So always start there. If you're doing harm, stop doing harm. But we at the FMF have developed kind of an alternative to the current policy paradigm in South Africa. We call that Liberty First, and it kind of speaks for itself. It was developed in response to the formation of the Government of National Unity, when I guess some of us still had hope that this is a reform-based government. That hope has since been squandered. But ultimately, it comes down to this. Around the world, you can see what has happened, and you can see what has worked after periods of profound injustice. Look at Soviet communism and look at how the former East Bloc countries came out of communism, centrally planned humanitarian disasters, roaring with economic growth and economic freedom and prosperity. What did they do? They reduced the size of their governments. They protected private property rights, decentralized political power. They deregulated, they liberalized their economy. They allowed businesses to make decisions for themselves, not getting permission from some commissar in the state government. They protected the value of their currency. They made sure that they did not devalue their currency, very important. And they embarked on free trade, trade of goods across borders. These 5 areas, the size of government, your legal system and property rights, your regulations, sound money, and international trade, these are the key things in which the International Economic Freedom of the World Index shows us very clearly around the world what has worked consistently and without exception. There is no free market economy anywhere on the planet that is poor. I challenge anyone to find me an example of a country that has strong property rights, decentralized government, small government, liberalized regulations, protected value of currency and international trade, and show me that that country is a poor one. You will not be able to do that. It works. Putting liberty first, putting the dignity of the individual first, putting the decision-making power of business leaders first, putting non-racialism first, putting the rule of law first, these things work. So that is really, that's the alternative. But again, start by ceasing with doing the bad thing, destructive things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think that was then the last question. I want to congratulate the researchers for a brilliant and in-depth report. Thank you very much for that. And we all hope that the outcome of this report will be to the benefit of our beautiful country. Thank you very much, you guys.